Hey family, it's Dr. Yola. I come to you with a heavy heart. We lost our hero yesterday, Chadwick Boseman, passing away at the age of 43 due to what I've read to be stage 4 colorectal cancer. It just hit me hard. I'm sure for a lot of us, it's as if a family member died because of what he represented, because of what he did, not just in terms of his art and creating such an excellent role model, but for what we now know he was able to accomplish in the middle of battling cancer. He gave us the Black Panther. He put in front of us some of our most amazing artists in terms of biopics, and doing that in the midst of battling cancer. So as I sat here between last night and today, one of my feelings is frustration. It's like I'm tired of Black people dying at such an early age. I'm tired and frustrated with the health disparities that we deal with on a regular basis. So instead of just sitting around feeling heavy, I figured I'd come to my family, bring some knowledge to my people to try to facilitate as much change as I can and embody my own superhero-ness in helping to protect us. So let's talk a little bit about colorectal cancer. There's no better time than now. If nothing else, let us do right by him and his memory and the legacy that he leaves behind by using his death as a propelling force for us to protect ourselves against something like colorectal cancer. So there are a couple of things I want to talk about. One, just going through the numbers. Two, I want to talk about risk factors. Three, I want to talk about the signs and symptoms of colorectal cancer. I want to talk about prevention. And then I want to talk about part of that prevention being screening. So who's impacted by colorectal cancer? Colorectal cancer has been perceived to be a disease of older people, 50 plus, because that's when we as physicians, as other healthcare professionals, have recommended that colorectal cancer screening be done at the age of 50. But that has now changed because more and more young people are being diagnosed with colorectal cancer. As of last year, over 10% of new colorectal cancer diagnoses were for individuals under the age of 50. Because of that, recommendations had to change. And then when we talk about health disparities, as we often have, especially in the midst of COVID, we have to look at racial differences in terms of colorectal cancer. African Americans are at a 20% higher risk of developing colorectal cancer, and we're at a 40% higher risk of dying from colorectal cancer. Here in the United States, African Americans lead all racial groups in terms of prevalence and deaths from colorectal cancer. And Alaskan Natives and Native Americans are seeing continuous increase in colorectal cancer diagnoses after the age of 50, even with screenings, compared to the rest of us, where we've actually seen declines in colorectal cancer for individuals 50 and older. But this isn't just a racial issue, it's an economic issue, because only 53% of those who receive Medicaid here in this country actually undergo colorectal cancer screening. Something has to change. So part of it is education, part of it is advocacy, and part of it is just changing how medicine is practiced. So let's talk about risk factors, because when we know better, we do better. The first set of risk factors fall under family history. If you know you have a family history of someone with colorectal cancer or genetically related colon issues like familial adenomatous polyposis. Big words, right? All that means is spontaneously the colon develops polyps. And then there's something called non-polyposis colon cancer, something called Lynch syndrome. And there are other genetically related disorders, particularly in pediatrics, something called Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, where polyps develop in addition to other manifestations throughout the body. So it's important to understand your family history. There was a point in time in my life where I didn't know one side of my family history. I was in the hospital and too embarrassed to admit that I didn't know one side of my family history, but that shouldn't be the case. So release all of that. If you are not in relationship or communication with your mother or father, or you're not in good communication with them, if you know of another family member that you can ask, get that information so that you go into your health history with eyes wide open. The second area that we have to focus on is personal history. If you have a personal history of polyps, of a previous diagnosis of colon cancer, a diagnosis of an inflammatory bowel disease such as Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, or if you have a history of diverticulosis, which is an outpouching of the intestines, or something called diverticulitis, which is inflammation resulting from diverticulosis, that's a reason to undergo screening. The other risk factors are associated with our chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes and obesity being the top ones. The third area that we have to focus on in terms of risk factors is our health habits. Diets high in sugar facilitate cancer formation, not just colorectal cancer, but many other cancers. Diets high in red meat and processed meats increase our risk of colorectal cancer. Diets low in fiber consumption increase our risk of colorectal cancer. And then our health habits, our physical activity, low levels of physical activity increase risk of colorectal cancer. Drinking moderate to significant amounts of alcohol increase our risk, as does smoking. So let's talk a little bit about the symptoms of colorectal cancer. And let me just say this, by the time you've developed symptoms and then are diagnosed with colorectal cancer, it's likely already spread. So what we want to be is in a position of prevention, not treatment. But if by chance you are concerned about colorectal cancer symptoms, these are the things you need to look out for. The most important being paying attention to your stool. These are conversations that I have often as a pediatrician. I'm always talking about poop. So I implore all of my adult doctors, my emergency room doctors, my internists, my family medicine physicians. I need you guys to start asking poop questions in the same way that we pediatricians do. And for the community, start talking to your doctor about your poop. Poop happens. Let's talk about it. So when it comes to colorectal cancer, the things you want to look out for are changes in your stool pattern and appearance. New onset constipation, where it's hard for stool to pass out or hard for you to actually pass it. You have to strain. Sometimes it's diarrhea, but it also may be smaller caliber, smaller, narrow-sized stools. That's why it's important to look in the toilet. Before you flush, eyeball what's going down. Look for size, color, because dark stools, dark tarry stools, black stools, stools with blood on it are clear concerns for colorectal cancer. If you wipe and see blood on the tissue, which you should be doing, you should be looking at the tissue, that's a sign that you need to be evaluated. Okay? These are the things I need us to look out for. If you're feeling full in your abdomen, you feel like you've got to go poop, you go poop and you still feel that sense of fullness and it continues, or you have lower abdominal pain, cramping pain that lasts and it goes beyond what you're used to. It's not a come and go, but it's a persistent pain. And then once the cancer has spread, we end up developing weight loss that we are not trying to achieve, weakness and fatigue. That's why we don't want to wait till it gets to that point. We want to be in a space again of prevention. We want to be proactive and not reactive. That means doing things to prevent us from developing colorectal cancer if we can. And as I mentioned before, the first step in prevention is knowing your risk. That means knowing what your family history is, asking those questions, making sure that you're fully aware of who had colorectal cancer or other issues and how old were they, so that when you go to a physician to advocate for yourself for a screening test, that you come in fully informed. The second is to make sure that, as I mentioned before, you pay attention to your stool pattern. You have to know your body. You have to be intimately involved with your body in order to advocate for yourself. The third thing is to make sure that you're eating a nutritious, fiber-rich diet. All right? Let's talk about what our daily fiber intake should look like. On average, we should be eating about 14 grams of fiber for every 1,000 calories we eat. I'll repeat that. We should be eating about 14 grams of fiber for every 1,000 calories we eat. For children, it varies from around 19 grams to about 25 grams, depending on how much they eat. For women, the daily recommendation is 25 grams of fiber a day, and for men, it's 38 grams. And just to give you a sense of how much food do I need to eat to get in that much fiber, 1 cup of black beans is the equivalent of 15 grams of fiber. You want to stick with your low glycemic fruits because those are usually the ones that have peel on them so that your blood sugar doesn't shoot up really fast. Pears, apples, your cherries, raspberries, things that are sort of seedy help to pass stool through. Your grains, steel-cut oats, rich grain breads, lentils, those are all excellent foods to be able to help you pass stool. And with that high intake of fiber, you need to pair that with high intake of water. You should be drinking half your body weight in water. So figure out whatever your weight is. Don't be embarrassed. Get on that scale to figure it out. This whole notion of 64 ounces or 8 glasses is arbitrary. For each individual person, it's different. So figure out your weight, divide it by half, and that's how much water you need to consume. And if you're struggling with either fiber consumption or water intake, there are ways to get it done. For fiber, if you're not ready in that space to increase your fruit and vegetable intake, get a fiber supplement. But make sure that you pair that with water consumption. Infuse your water with fruit. Do a slight splash of juice. Get a sparkling water, but drink water because water helps facilitate the passage of stool. Decrease your sugar consumption. So what we want to do is no more than 6 teaspoons of added sugar for children and women. No more than 12 teaspoons of sugar for men. And your sugary drinks are the leading source. So cut that out and get you some water. That's what I want us to be able to do in order to prevent our risk of colorectal cancer. The other is to cut back on alcohol. I'm not going to tell you to not get your glass of wine in every once in a while, but drink in moderation and cut back, if not quitting smoking. If nothing else comes out of COVID-19 with all the loss that we have experienced collectively and individually, now's the time to get our health habits in order. Now's the time to pay attention to our bodies and treat them like the temples that they are. For ourselves, for our children, for the generations to come. We have to set the example. We have to be the example. And then we have to make sure that we are getting the necessary screenings so that we are aware of our colon and our rectal health. Now let's talk a little bit about the difference between a screening exam and a diagnostic exam. When you are diagnosed with colorectal cancer, it's because you've likely developed symptoms or you have very strong, very significant family history that you end up being diagnosed. So usually diagnosis results from symptoms. And as I just mentioned, you don't develop symptoms from colorectal cancer until you're late in the game. And then there's screening, which means I have no symptoms. I'm just checking to make sure that my colon and my rectum, my entire digestive system is where it's supposed to be. And there are 2 different ways in which we do that. Now, before, the age recommendation was 50, but as I said before, over 10% of newly diagnosed colorectal cancer cases will be in individuals less than 50. So now the recommendation is for us to be screened at 45 years old or earlier, depending on your family history. So again, I mentioned, know what your family history is. And if Aunt Nene was diagnosed with colon cancer at 40, that means you need to be screened at 30. All right? And there are 2 different ways in which we screen. We do screening in the office through stool testing, and then there's visualization through either colonoscopy or through a CT scan. Let's talk about the stool test. There's the stool occult test, or the stool immunochemical test, or the stool DNA test. The stool occult test looks for blood in your stool. It's that old school test where we smear a little poop on the card and put some drops on it, and if it turned blue, you had blood in your stool. And then there's the stool immunochemical test, similar testing structure. 3 separate stool samples need to be done. This isn't one of those things that we do in the office. I drop the drops and then I know what your risk is. It requires at least 3 separate stool samples at your house. And I know how challenging this can be. I've had to do it myself. But go on and do this so that we know what our risk is, right? And then the other stool-based test, the DNA test for the presence of genetic materials, genetic markers associated with colon cancer. That as the stool passes through the large intestines, the stool picks those cells up and then we can test for it. And these are some of those home-based testing modalities. And then there's the visualization test. This is the test at 45 years of age or younger, depending on your family history. Either in the way of a colonoscopy, where you go through a bowel clean out. And I know it's a pain. I've gone through the process myself. It is a pain in the butt. Pun fully intended, but it's necessary. Because even if one of those stool tests come back abnormal, it still then means you have to have a colonoscopy or CT colonography, all right? The colonoscopy means that there's a camera taken through the colon in order to actually visualize what the colon wall looks like, to look for polyps, precancerous or cancerous lesions. And then the CT colonography is similar, except that is not an actual visualization, but a virtual visualization through a CT scan. You go through the same bowel clean out, but for individuals who may not tolerate colonoscopy, this is an alternate way of doing it. And a lot of these modalities really depend on health insurance coverage and physician referral. So you fight like you've never fought before to make sure that you get the screening that you deserve. We know that there is bias in medicine. We know that in this country, healthcare is a business and not a right, but we're going to make it a right because we're going to insist, we are going to demand that we get the same access to health screenings that everyone else does. I don't care if you have Medicaid or private insurance. You now know at the age of 45 without family history of colorectal issues, you get screened. And if you have a family history, it's 10 years younger than when your family member was diagnosed, period, point blank. And if your healthcare provider refuses, you fire them and find another one who will. That's what we need to do. We are going to advocate for each other. We're going to affect change and we're going to reverse these health disparities. That's my goal. That's my goal. That's the thing that I'm going to do for Chadwick Boseman and every other individual, particularly African-American individual who has lost their lives to colorectal cancer and at such a young age. That's my commitment, is to do what I can to provide education and to provide advocacy and to provide referrals if I need to. So holla at your girl, ask Dr. Yola. Not a shameless plug for my business, but if you need it, you're going to get it one way or another. We will no longer sit by and allow others to dictate our health outcomes. We're taking control, and we will be our brothers and sisters keepers in medicine, in community, to make sure that each of us is protected, each of us is screened, and each of us stays in a space of prevention. Because we know that 1 inch of prevention is worth way more than a pound of cure. And it's time to put that in full effect. I love you guys. I look forward to continuing to engage with you, to provide you with the education necessary to make informed decisions. You let me know if you have any questions and how I can advocate for us. Love you guys. Dr. Yola out. Wakanda forever.